No. Stand by.
Two, okay.
That's not me. Oh, that is me.
What's happening?
Hi, thank you all for coming. Boy, it's loud. My name is Bob Bates, and I'm a game designer at Legend Entertainment. I started writing games at Legend at Infocom in 1986. Started writing text adventures, story games that had no pictures. In 1989, Mike Verdu and I started a company called Legend Entertainment, and for the last 10 years, we've been writing adventure games or story games. But the most recent game that has come out of Legend is Glenn Dahlgren's Wheel of Time game. And that game is a fantasy shooter. It's an action game. And the next game that's coming out of Legend is the sequel to Epic's Unreal, which is called Unreal 2, which is being designed by my partner, Mike Verdu. Both of these games are action games, and so one of the things, as a group of game designers whose roots are in storytelling, we think a lot about the issues of bringing stories into the action genre and how to do that. So we think a lot about that, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. And I guess the first question is this really a good idea? And I think the answer is yes. Obviously, the key to an action game is to keep the player moving, keep him doing things, get his adrenaline pumping, give him a sense of urgency. But if you can put all of that action into the context of a story, if you can raise the stakes by making him care about the character that he's playing, if you can give him goals that he is pursuing in the context of an overall mission, then we think that that actually enhances gameplay instead of being essentially just one level after another. So the challenge is, how do you bring storytelling into an action game without ruining what's cool about an action game in the first place, which is, of course, the action? The place to begin is with the fundamentals of storytelling. The basics of storytelling don't change no matter what medium you're using, whether you're a book author or a screenwriter or writing for TV. The basic elements of character, setting, and plot are always the things that you're working with. That's what traditional authors do, and that's what we need to do as game designers as well. The way that I think about that, a less formal way to talk about it, is I think of interesting people doing interesting things in interesting places. And so as I design a game, those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about trying to do. Let's start with plot. And the well-known three-act structure. This basic structure, the structure of a plot, was first laid out a very long time ago by Aristotle in his Poetics. And when you associate Aristotle with something like that, that tends to sort of make an idea almost unapproachable, puts a little halo around it, makes it hard to understand. But really, all the three-act structure is, all he's saying is that a story needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Seems pretty obvious, but a lot of times it doesn't get through. A story starts at the moment that your main character has a problem. That's the moment that you need to begin your game. Now, a lot of writers, a lot of book writers and a lot of game writers actually begin their game well before the beginning, which isn't a good idea. They'll do a long introductory cutscene that'll show the history of the world and lay out the geography of all the different places. And they'll talk about the hero when he was a baby and then growing up and all this sort of thing. And after a long time, when he's decided that the player is finally ready to experience his special creation, he gets things moving. And that's all wrong. What you need to do, if you go to a bookstore or a newsstand and pick up an adventure book, an action book, and look at the first page, what you're going to find is that the author dumps you into the middle of an action scene. You'll find bullets flying and bombs exploding and people running around, and that's going to go on for the first several pages, and it's only after that first little mini crisis is resolved that the author takes a few moments to catch his breath and explain who these people are and why they're in trouble. That's what you should be thinking about as you design an action game, as you start your action game. You should think about starting with a small piece of action where the player doesn't have to know much. He might not have to know a whole lot about the controls. He might not have to know anything about the world. You just put him in a situation where he has very little choice about what to do, and he runs around and tries to achieve a small goal that's fairly obvious. In a situation like that, he will pick up a lot of the story without any formal exposition from you. The mere look and feel of the game, the way that it looks, the obstacles that you put in his path, the sorts of things that you've chosen to confront him with, tells him a lot about the story that he's about to experience. By giving him that problem and making him deal with it, you've begun the process of storytelling. A few game examples. In Abe's Odyssey, the true beginning of that story is when Abe discovers that he is destined or planned to be meat. In Unreal, it's when the ship crashes and you've got to get out. In Half-Life, the true beginning of Half-Life is not the long introductory sequence, although that's nice. The true beginning is when you suddenly realize that something has gone terribly wrong at the Black Mesa facility. If you think about the opening of Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's a good example for what we're talking about. Here's an action movie with a good story, and the movie opens with this character emerging from the jungle in front of this beautiful waterfall, and he takes out two pieces of paper and he holds them up and puts them together, and it's a map. Now, without any words, without any long introduction, you've established setting, character, and plot. He's an adventurer of some kind. He's in this exotic jungle location, and the plot, it's treasure. He's a treasure hunter. This is the beginning. You've given the hero his problem. How does he find the treasure? In the next couple of minutes, I'm going to read what actually happens there because I can't remember it all. It says, in the next few minutes, he flicks a gun away from a man with his bullwhip. He enters a cave full of poisonous spiders, puts his hand in a shaft of light to set off a booby-trapped wall of pointed spikes. He swings on his whip across a bottomless pit. He uses a torch to spring a paving stone trap, and then he swaps the weighted bag of sand for the golden idol. And then just when you think he's succeeded, then the boulder starts, and he has to run for his life to outrun that huge boulder that everyone remembers. In each of these cases, and the reason I bring it up in the context of the game world, in each of these cases, the hero is confronted with a set of obstacles that are appropriate to this exotic setting that they've put him in. That's what you need to do as a game designer. As an action game designer, you should be coming up with threats and obstacles to the hero, to the player, that are appropriate to the story and the setting, and then give him the means to deal with those problems with objects or material that, again, are appropriate to the setting that you've put him in. When Indiana Jones comes out of the cave and the bad guy comes and takes that idol away from him, that is the end of the beginning and the beginning of the middle of the story. In the middle of the story, this is a time when you can sit back a little bit and start to fill in some of the character's background and to set his actions in a larger context. This is the time in Raiders of the Lost Ark when we learn that this character is Indiana Jones. He's not just a money-grubbing treasure hunter. He is an archaeologist with far nobler motives. When you think about the middle of the story, if you map it out on a piece of paper, it should look like a series of ascending arcs. until it reaches the climax. And the idea is that you give the player a short-term goal to be going after. He kind of knows what the long-term goal is. He's got to rescue the princess, save the world, whatever it is. But in the meantime, you've got something that you've put down right in front of him that, in the context of a level or whatever, is his short-term goal. And as he battles through that level and he achieves that goal, then he's got a little piece of glory to hang on to. That way, the player continually makes progress through the game, and you have this rising series of curves. And every time he overcomes an obstacle, you put another obstacle in his place. But they shouldn't be just any obstacles. And that's one of the things that right now in our action games, by and large, they are just any obstacles. In the best of stories and traditional fiction, the hero has internal conflicts, or faults or fears, but things that he has to overcome, personal things that he has to deal with before he's ready to go off and achieve the final goal. So if you do your job right as a game designer, the obstacles that you choose to put in the way of the hero should be obstacles that reveal the hero's inner fears. You should figure out, what is this guy most afraid of? What is the thing that he hopes most won't happen? And then you make that happen to him. And that way, as he overcomes these obstacles and goes through the game, he experiences what is called character growth. And you learn more about the character, and you become more involved with him, and you associate with him better, you like him better. The end of a story is when the hero solves his problem. The end of the story should be kind of like a symphony. If you're a composer, you have different themes. You have your main theme, that's probably your hero. You have different themes that you've introduced and variations on those themes along the way. But at the end of the symphony, you bring all of those themes together and unite them somehow in harmony for a grand finale. In the game, what your hero needs to do is overcome those internal problems, and once he's done that, he's ready to face the external embodiment of his internal problems, and that is, of course, the ultimate bad guy. Now, for bonus points, if you've done your job right, this ultimate bad guy has actually been the source of many of the obstacles that you've put in the character's path along through the course of the game. Now, the reason this makes sense, if any story in any game needs conflict. You have the hero, you've got his goals, and yet if all he did was to start here and go unobstructed to there, you wouldn't have an interesting story or game. And so something has got to want your hero, something in the game world has got to want your hero not to succeed, and that's the villain. A lot of times when I'm designing problems or obstacles for the hero, what I find it most helpful to do is to think about the villain. He's sitting over here saying, I'm looking at that guy, I don't want him to succeed, so how am I going to stop him? How am I going to put obstacles in his way to keep him from reaching his goal? Now, early in the game, the player probably isn't aware that some of these obstacles are actually coming from the ultimate bad guy. But later in the game, he probably is, and that gives you just all the more satisfaction when you reach the end and you whip his butt, then that feels really good. And so as you think about an action game, as you think about the challenges that are in the levels, when you think about the monsters or the creatures or whatever the foes are, they should relate somehow to the inner conflicts that the player has, and they should also be there at the behest of the bad guy, so that at the end it's really satisfying to wipe him out. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about plot and the three-act structure. An easy way that I have found to remember this structure through the years and just think about it from time to time is that in the first act, what you need to do is get your hero up a tree. And in the second act, you maybe explain a little bit about who this hero is, But mostly what you do is you throw rocks at him and make his life harder. And then in the third act, you get him down out of the tree. Now, I said that a story needs plot, setting, and character, and I've just talked about plot, but I'm going to really just pass right over setting, because I think that's something that in our industry we actually already do pretty well. In movies and in TV, producers always have this problem. They're battling budgets and they're battling screenwriters at the same time, but what they end up doing is they put a lot of scenes in very boring places. You have the scene in the restaurant, you have the scene in the hotel room, you have the scene in the guy's living room. In our games, you don't see a lot of scenes in the office and scenes in the hotel room. We tend to set our games in exotic locales. I think our artists are really good at presenting those scenes, and I think that they're kind of out in front of the writers in what they do. I think that eye candy is a priority with most development groups, and so I think we're okay on setting, and I'm just going to move on and talk about character. Characters are the most interesting part of stories. Events themselves are really only interesting insofar as they tell us something about the people that they're happening to. You've probably heard the saying that writers despair over, that there are actually only 7 basic plots, and I don't know if that's true or not, but I certainly hear it all the time. But it doesn't really matter, because there are millions of stories that get told from those plots, and the reason is because there is an infinite variety of character. There's interesting people that we care about as these plots happen to them. Plot without character is about as interesting as a shopping list. It's just one thing happening after another, sort of like one level happening right after another. When the poet said, "Man is the measure of all things," another way of thinking about that is that what people are really interested in is people. So that's why thinking about characters in a story-based game, even in an action game, is very important. Now, a lot of designers don't want to create a strong central character. Certainly in the early days, going all the way back to the U at Infocom, that wonderful amorphous hero, the designers, we thought that what should really be happening is that the player should step into the outline of this hero and fill his character with the player's own personality traits, idiosyncrasies. It was all about, letting him do what he wants to do without imposing on him. And I'm thinking that that's probably not such a good idea. I think that successful games these days, both commercially and artistically, a lot of times have heroes that have well-defined personalities. Players seem very content to step into the shoes of characters like Duke Nukem and Lara Croft and even James Bond, without trying to impose their personalities on the character. Just as audiences manage to identify with the action hero that's up on the screen, game players seem to revel in taking on the personality of this larger-than-life hero for a few hours and being that person. Creating one of these memorable characters is hard, but it is rewarding, and again, I think both commercially and artistically. As part of the research that I'm doing right now for the game that I'm working on, I'm reading a lot of biographies, I'm reading a lot about fictional heroes, and also about real-life heroes. And I'd like to read you 2 very brief quotes from a biography of Lawrence of Arabia that I just came across when I was coming on the plane out to the conference. In the first quote, Lawrence's brother says, "What he hid, I believe, was a tender reverence for human life, which his duty as a soldier compelled him to violate, and so he was always stressed by an inner conflict." To me, that's a really interesting idea. As I'm thinking about a hero for an action game, instead of having somebody who just blasts his way through, I'm thinking about a character. I'm thinking about a person. I'm thinking about, is this somebody who really wants to be doing this? And if he doesn't, then why is he doing it? What's compelling him to do it? What are the consequences of him doing it? It's fertile ground for a game designer to think about. And then a few pages later, in the second quote, the biographer lays out, this was great. It was a great definition of why we like heroes. He says, a vital ingredient in hero valuing or hero making is the resonance that the follower or worshiper finds between the conflicts and aspirations of his own and those he perceives in the person he chooses to idealize. The hero needs to appear to have mastered his struggle to achieve his ideals in such a way that an identification with him seems to offer the possibility of similar mastery to the follower. I read that and was bowled over. To me, that's great stuff. As you think about creating your hero character, try to think about problems that we all have, or that many of us have as individuals, and then let us fantasize through your hero that we might be able to solve them. So that's good stuff for thinking about creating a hero character. Another good thing to keep in mind, as was pointed out to me by the head of the marketing department, another thing to keep in mind is when you walk into CompUSA, you want to be able to envision this character in an 8-foot-tall stand-up. So you want him to look like an action hero, but I think it's neat to have the idea that there's these inner workings going on. Another interesting problem that I'm wrestling with right now, is what to do with this character once you have him. In traditional literature, the worth of a story, when the critics review it, or when posterity judges it, a lot of times what they look at is character growth. They say, what are the changes that are wrought on the hero by the misfortunes that he encounters? How does he grow? What does he learn? How does what happened to him change him into a different person? How does his approach to life change? So as I'm thinking about doing an action game, I think, I should really be doing that. But then I thought, there's a whole class of stories where the hero doesn't change at all. He's the same at the end as he is at the beginning. He bends the events to his will. James Bond is a great example of this. James Bond is the same suave, debonair secret agent at the end of the movie that he was at the beginning of the movie. There is no character growth there. And you know what? I'm not sure that we want it. If he was a different guy, we want him to be that same suave, debonair secret agent, and we want to count on that the next time we go see another James Bond movie. And if it wasn't that way, then we'd be disappointed. So that's one of the things that I'm actually wrestling with right now as I think about the character for my next game. Is this a character that you want to see change and grow, or is it a character that you want to know when he first takes center stage, boy, that's the guy, and he's not going to change as he goes through? One other thing I wanted to say about characters is non-player characters, NPCs. They can fill an important role that we don't often think about that secondary characters play in movies. And that is that they can show the audience things that the hero is sort of not allowed to show. So when you have the steely-eyed hero gazing down, at the evil villain without a tremor in his hand at the climax, and all the villagers are standing by with a knuckle in their mouth and their eyes wide in horror. The reason that the director cuts to that shot is so that the audience can know that this is dangerous stuff going on here. Because you can't have the hero say, hey, this is pretty dangerous. You have to have another mechanism for that. And in the gaming world, that would be your NPCs. You can have characters comment or look on or shrink back or otherwise provide information about emotions and reactions that your main character really isn't allowed to do. Of course, the master at this is Steven Spielberg. If you watch any Spielberg movie at moments of high tension, a lot of times he will cut off to these secondary characters so that you can see the sadness in their faces or the fear in their faces or the joy in their faces, and that's a signal to the audience saying, this is what's going on here. But of course, we're dealing with games, and games we have this problem of interactivity. And that presents special challenges to any game designer who wants to tell stories. In traditional media, the author controls everything. He controls the story, he controls the pace, and the audience passively absorbs all the choices that he's made. But in games, there's a direct conflict between the freedom that we need to allow the player to have in order to enjoy the game and the linearity that any well-constructed story needs in order to get its job done. So the solution to this problem is to create a series of areas in which the player does have freedom, but then to string those areas together in a linear sequence, in a linear fashion. In other words, what we're talking about here, we've already solved this particular problem. We're talking about levels. Movies have scenes, books have chapters. The level should be the primary unit of storytelling in an action game. In a level, the player should be presented with a limited challenge that somehow fits into the larger story. How that challenge is met is going to vary from player to player depending on his level of skill and his various abilities and the kinds of things that you let him do. You can create different ways to solve different problems, but once he's solved that, once he's finished the level, however he's done it, the storyteller knows that, and that's the time to then slip in a little bit of storytelling, either through perhaps a new set of mission instructions or perhaps a cutscene that shows the results of what you just did and then sets you up with a new set of mission goals for where you're about to go, which is a technique that Glenn used very successfully in The Wheel of Time. When you finished a level, he would pick up, the cutscene would sort of pick up where you just were, and even though it was non-interactive, it was clearly your character moving on to the next event. As a limited example of something like this, think about a level in which you say to the player that he needs to reach an inn by sundown, but in the way there's a river. And so somehow he's got to get across that river. And it doesn't really matter to you as a storyteller whether he swims across the river or whether he finds a vine and puts it on a branch and swings across the river, or whether, action game, there's a troll on the bridge and he fights his way past the troll and gains access to the inn that way. The important thing is that he finds a way to triumph over adversity and live to the end of the day. The player fills in the details of the story, but the author has kept the main threads of the story in his own hands, and he says to the player, yes, it was your individual ingenuity, your individual talents that got you here, but now, you know what, there's a new set of monsters waiting over the horizon for tomorrow, and oh, by the way, meanwhile, here's what's going on back at the castle. So the level is the unit of storytelling. It's an area of freedom where we give the player the interactivity that he needs, and then the cut scene or the period of time in between the levels is when you can advance the story. So to be even more specific about how to get this task done, let's talk about the tools of the trade. In the past, we've looked to book authors as models for our storytelling, but these days I think that our task actually resembles much more closely the same task that a screenwriter has. And I think that it's a filmmaker's tools that we need to master. This is especially true when we present cutscenes and dialogue and or any scripted events, things like that. The screenwriter has the same set of tools to work with that we do. He's got a screen that he can put pictures on, and characters that he can move around that screen in some sort of interesting setting. If you look at a screenplay, it's an interesting document. It's a very spare document, a very Spartan document. All the screenwriter is allowed to do in a screenplay is identify the setting, put words in the mouth of the actors, and define the actors' actions and movements. He's not allowed, like a novelist, to go on at great length about the character's inner motivations or how he feels about that, or anything that is internal to any of the characters. Anything that he wants the audience to know, he has to find a way to put up there on the screen. He has to show, not tell, which is a classic piece of advice for all kinds of writers, but either through dialogue or action, that's what what the screenwriter has to tell his story up there on the screen, and we have the same task, and I think we have the same limitations. And because of that, what I recommend is that anybody who's doing this kind of thing actually go out and buy a book on screenwriting and give that a look. One in particular that has been useful to me was written by Richard Walter, who's the head of the film writing school at UCLA. It's called Screenwriting. And there's another book he's written called The Whole Picture, which includes some of that information, but then goes on to also talk about other aspects of production and that sort of thing. So let's look at some of these tools that are in the game designer's toolbox. Cutscenes. Cutscenes are really mini movies where you, as a game designer, get to be the director and the cameraman and the screenwriter all rolled into one. But with those roles come responsibilities. And the problem that you've got is that everyone who plays your game is going to have grown up watching professional TV and movies. And they're going to immediately compare what you do to their own internal standards of quality that they have developed over many, many years. So you can't say, oh, this is just a game, so it doesn't really matter. If you don't have professional quality dialogue or action or camera placement or actor movement, any of those things, then the player's going to roll his eyes and the whole suspension of disbelief is gone, and the reviewers are going to skewer you and life will not be good. Every cutscene should have a specific goal, whether it's to develop character, to introduce a new environment, to advance the plot, or set out the mission goals for the level that's yet to come. When you design the cutscene, you should really do this in conjunction with professionals who know what they're doing, usually writers and artists who will help you storyboard the cutscene ahead of time and will really help you accomplish your goals with the most economy. This has double benefits. Not only will the player appreciate the professionalism that you've brought to the task, but it will help your budget by avoiding long-winded scenes that are boring and very costly. The next tool, scripted events. Very useful in action games. Scripted events are brief sequences that are usually triggered by something that the player does, although they can also be time-based. They are a moment in the middle of the action when, sometimes surreptitiously, sometimes not, the author takes control for just those few seconds away from the player and slips in another little bit of storytelling. It could be a little snippet of dialogue between a couple characters. It could be a small bit of action over there on the side. You could swing the camera over and show that and come back, and then you've got the game controls back again. And these can be very effective in doing all kinds of things, like imparting backstory, building character, or reorienting the player towards a new goal in the middle of a mission. If he starts the mission with one thing in mind, everything blows up on him. In a scripted sequence, you can redirect the player towards a new goal. Probably the premier example of this, of the use of scripted events in an action game, is the early portion of Half-Life. I kind of think of Half-Life as kind of parting the curtain a little bit and letting us have a quick peek at something that we're all going to be doing in the years to come. And then, of course, it closed the curtain real quick, which was unfortunate, but it was very instructive to see the early portions of Half-Life, how they accomplished so much storytelling in the context of an action game. Another tool of the trade, dialogue. Good game dialogue, good dialogue, doesn't sound anything like normal speech. If you see somebody sitting down and saying, okay, I'm going to write dialogue that sounds natural, then be worried. Because normal speech, when we talk, we stutter, we stammer, we repeat ourselves, we say a lot, and in a movie or a game, the dialogue has got to be a lot better than that. It's got to be crisp, it's got to be to the point, there can't be a word wasted. The whole point is that you don't want to waste the player's time, and you don't want to let his attention wander for a second. You want to keep him riveted, and as soon as you start putting extraneous verbiage up on the screen or into his ears, his attention's going to wander and you're going to lose him. Furthermore, every line of dialogue has got to do at least double duty. It must both advance the story and develop character. And then you get bonus points if you can slip in some conflict there too. So here are a few quick tips for writing dialogue. The first is to never have a character say something in dialogue that the player already knows. That's just a waste of the player's time. So if the player sees the refinery blow up and then he runs into the guard booth, you don't have the guard say, hey, the refinery just blew up. It's redundant and worthless. You haven't moved the story forward, you haven't given the player anything new. More subtly, never give information to the player by having one character say to another character something that other character already knows. That's the real mark of an amateur when you see a line like, well, as you already know, Lord Veldrin, the magic spell can only work when all three of the magical stones are in place. There's no reason in your game story for one guy to be telling another guy something that he already knows, and if all you're doing is trying to get information to the player, you have to find another way to do that. The last thing I want to say about dialogue is remember that less is more. Keep it short. In the end, your game should be your hero's story. Of course, you have to be careful not to screw up what makes an action game good in the first place. But you can still take a fast and furious gameplay and set it in a more interesting context by wrapping an interesting story around it. You don't want the storytelling to interrupt that fast and furious experience. You don't want a guy in the middle of a firefight and then stop what he's doing in order to read something on the screen or get new information. You want to respect what makes those games good, but then fill in around the edges the things that will make a good story. The genre is definitely restrictive. We've got conventions that we have to observe, and it may seem that there is little room for creativity, but it's nowhere near as restricted a genre as, say, the Elizabethan revenge tragedy was, when some producer, no doubt, came to Shakespeare and said, I really need a play. Why don't you take this old story called Hamlet and give me a revenge tragedy based on it? So starting with that, even within the confines of that very restrictive environment, he was able to do a wonderful story with really good characters. And having just talked for a long time about how to tell a story and the mechanics of how to tell a story, I should say that the first step is really that you need to have a story that is worth telling. This isn't something that you can treat lightly. You can't just say, I know what we'll do. We'll have this weird planet that nobody's ever seen before, and the villain will kidnap the hero's sister, and he's got to go rescue her. Yes, that's it. That's our story. It may be that your story ends up being that, but that's not where you can start. So, where do you start? If I could make everybody go back in time, I would say go see Chris Vogler's session earlier today called The Writer's Journey. He has a book called The Writer's Journey, and it talks about some of the underlying principles that under many myths, and he believes under most successful stories. And I think that this actually has application to us as writers. I think that an author, or a game writer, or a game designer, his job is to have a vision, is to have a purpose, or a greater truth, something that you're presenting in the game. And you have the job that any artist has. You need to think of yourself as a hero. Not a Lawrence of Arabia kind of hero, but a Joseph Campbell kind of hero. I think every author and every artist must make what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey. I think you have to step outside of contemporary society, accepted philosophy, and you have to look back at the way the world is and discover something about that that's worth talking about. Or perhaps something about the way that you think the world should be and isn't, and that becomes the thing that you want to talk about. You have to go beyond the boundaries of the known and accepted in search of something that's new and different and important and worth telling a story about. What you acquire on that journey is the hero's prize. It's that thing which only you know. It's that thing, and maybe many of you probably already have that thing. It's one of the things that makes us individuals. When we think about the world and we look at life, we say, everybody thinks that this is true, but you know what? This thing here is not true. And not only that, but it's important that it's not true. So some people come to that just in the normal course of their lives, and some people, I think, have got to, when they're sitting down to write a story, to think about what it is that is the thing that in their heart they know is what they want to talk about, the thing that only they know, the thing that the world doesn't know. When you go on that hero's journey and you find that prize, you need to bring it back to the rest of us and tell us about it. That's what a hero does. That's what in traditional stories and traditional myths, that's what the hero does. He goes off, he acquires the magic elixir, the golden fleece, whatever it is, and he brings it back for the betterment of his society. And that's what we as writers or as game designers, that's what we should be thinking about, is what is that piece of wisdom that I have that I'm going to present in my game. If you take that journey, then that piece of knowledge will actually become embedded in your game. It will inform all of your design decisions as you go along. And it doesn't, I'm not talking about something that will be preachy. Star Wars is a good example of that. The first Star Wars movie was an action movie, but it was clearly a movie with a theme and a message that came through just fine. But it was an action story, and we can do the same in our games. You can have your game be about something without hitting the player over the head with it and saying this is a moral story. So what I encourage you to do is think about that thing which only you know. And that thing will pervade your game, and it will keep your interest up in the game across the 18 months to 2 years of development hell. As you're developing this thing, saying, why am I doing this? Oh yes, because it's important to me. It's something that I care about. And eventually it will become the thing that your game is actually about. And if you're successful at that, then that will be a story that'll be worth playing. that's everything I had to say. I wanted to thank you for coming and to remember to fill out your evaluation forms, but I also wanted to leave a lot of time here for question and answer. And I guess we have 13 minutes for that. So can we bring up the house lights? Is that possible? Or can people come forward to ask questions? Does anybody have any questions? Okay, in the middle there? The question is storytelling possible in a multiplayer gaming environment? I think it's really hard to do that. I don't know. I've been a single-player game designer my whole career, so I don't have expertise in that area. As I think about it, I think about the ability of those game designers to create new missions, to introduce new things into the world. But I think that that's a very generalized experience, and it's not the same kind of storytelling that I'm talking about. I think pretty clearly there's not a hero, and I'm not sure that there's a value or a message or that bit of wisdom. I'm not sure how you can bring that to that environment. So I can't help much with that. And right next to you, there was somebody with their hand up as well? No. Over here? The question is, even though we've introduced interactivity into the game, players frequently feel that they're being led by the nose down the perfect path towards what the game designer had in mind. This is a very old problem in game design, and it's the conflict between linearity and an open environment. And I think the key to that is to create an open environment where if you come on an area where there are many creatures, monsters, many enemies that you've got to deal with, there are lots of different ways that you can deal with those creatures. You can have your choice of weapons, you can run away, you can lure them over the cliff, as a game designer, you can create many ways for the player to exercise his own individuality in dealing with the immediate threat at hand. It's when that threat is over that you do the storytelling, and I don't think that there is a way around that. So are the actions of the player meaningless? I don't really think so. I think what the player wants to feel is that he is the hero of his own story, that he's the hero of the story that you're telling. And so he wants to feel that if it wasn't him playing, then the world would all go to hell. That it's his own particular talents and his own particular cleverness or his own particular strategy that succeeded in winning the day. And so what you do is you allow that to happen, but then in those series of chunks, in between those periods of time, you move the story along. Other questions? All the way in the back. I'm not sure that I heard the question. Is the question, what do I think about the player character speaking in the course of the game? Yeah, okay. I think that's a good idea. It's an idea, again, that I'm thinking about now. I think that you can, I think it helps you a lot. Nothing establishes character like hearing a voice and hearing somebody's choice of words as he talks. And so having your character comment on things as you go along is a very, very effective way of feeding information to the player about who this hero really is. That's especially easy if your character is, if it's a light game, if it's a comedy game, because then you've got it made. But if you're dealing with sort of this dark, anti-hero kind of character, it's hard to know what words to put in his mouth as he's going along dealing with these creatures. So it varies from character to character, but I really like the idea of doing that. I think it's a good idea. Over here? I'm afraid I cannot, I'm not hearing. You're designing educational games? And the problem with educational games, I think in general, is that a lot of times the bones show through. People don't like knowing that they're being taught. And that's why I think there's a real tension in when I'm talking about, deciding what your game is about and presenting that and having that, pervade your game. There's a real danger that somebody will say, whoa, 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 that the bones will show through, that somebody will say, hey, you're just trying to teach me a lesson here. And so you shouldn't do that. An educational game tends to be more overt about that, and my own belief is the more you can hide it, the better off you are. Unless you're trying to sell it to a teacher. So I don't know that I can help you much. Right here in the front? And if you can speak up a little bit here, because I'm having difficulty hearing. The question is, can I comment on the difference in storytelling techniques between Japanese-developed games and American-developed games? Unfortunately, the answer is no, I can't. One of the unfortunate parts of being a game writer is that I don't get to play a lot of games. And so on my list of things to do is to play games, for example, like Zelda. Every time I talk about my current game design, everybody says, you know what you need to do? You need to go play Zelda. So I don't know, I don't have the knowledge base to talk about that. I've played American design games, but I'm not experienced in the Japanese games. Right here?
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the topic of reconciling a profoundly non-linear level structure with the structure of the Mythic Quest that the heroes do. It seems to be pretty linear, at least at first glance.
The question is, do I have any thoughts about reconciling sort of a very open environment with the what seemed like the very linear requirements of the hero's journey that was, I guess, laid out in Chris Vogler's session? Yeah. A couple things to remember about that, and Chris emphasized it a couple times. The process that he laid out is not something. It's not a Bible. It's not even a roadmap. It's more kind of like an idea, a collection of thoughts. And it's true that good stories tend to follow those kinds of rhythms and tend to have those kinds of characters in them. One thing he didn't talk about is how often the masks or the characters are actually worn by the same character in a book or in a movie, where you might have, for example, the guardian to the threshold guardian may actually turn out to be the same character as your mentor character. So you come across, some barrier, and it's and there's a guy there saying, no, no, you can't cross. You pass some test or whatever, and then he becomes your mentor. So there's that kind of flexibility within the structure that he's talking about. But in general, this question of linearity versus openness is something that I think will always be a tension with every game that we ever do. In order to effectively tell a story, you have to have some linearity. You as an author, you've got to know what the player knows and when he knows it. Because you can't say, you can't tell him that the princess has escaped from the tower now, you don't have to worry, if you don't know that he was aware in the first place that the princess was in the tower. So there are things that you have to know that the player knows, and that, by definition, that's linearity. So the best I can do for you is to say, create these big open areas where the player can do a lot of stuff that is very free, and then squeeze that to a close, do a little storytelling, and open it up again, and then as you go along in there, look for opportunities for scripted sequences and little snippets of dialogue and things, you know, like the character saying, and get your storytelling done that way. I feel very strongly that this idea of storytelling, if we do it wrong, we're really going to screw up the action. And so you have to think hard about fitting it in around the edges.
I want to take exception to what you said about setting, although I absolutely agree with you that games generally do setting well because it's about eye candy, it's about escapism. But don't you feel that we're kind of game genre and play paths and gameplay patterns kind of put us in a rut? Don't you go to E3 and get sick of looking at the same gloss on either Blade Runner or Road Warrior or Lord of the Rings? And what can we do about that?
The question is, taking issue with my statement that we as an industry are dealing well with setting, especially in the face of going to E3 and seeing a million different takes on either Blade Runner or Lord of the Rings or whatever. I don't know how to answer that. To me, I look at games and I get blown away by the interesting ways that people have done things. I look at our own game, and I don't mean to plug it, but I look at Wheel of Time, and I think what the artists and the level designers did in that game was beautiful. I look at some of the other games that are coming along, and I see frozen wastes and barren planets and deserts and sand dunes and all kinds of games set in all kinds of interesting places. And if somebody adheres strictly to that medieval Lord of the Rings thing, either shame on them, or they better have a good reason for doing it. And one good reason is something I think a lot about that I call new tide. We've been buying new tide all of our lives. Every publisher will tell you that he wants something new and different and never before seen, and it's not true. What he wants is something that's 90% of something that he's familiar with 10% of something that's new. So that's kind of my answer to that, and we have time for one more question. Right here? I'm sorry, I can't hear you again. Okay. That would take a long time to answer completely. The question is, it seems like the industry has backed away from the traditional single-player adventure game. Is that true? And if so, why do I think it's true? In a nutshell, yes, I think it's true. Why do I think it's true? I think it's true because too many adventure games had bad puzzles I think that they cost too much to develop, and they did not do an adequate job of storytelling. So although we idealize it and we sort of think of those games as being the epitome of storytelling, as you just said, that storytelling in its purest form, anytime you put obstacles in the way of a player on the way to telling a story, you've got a problem. And if those obstacles are insurmountable, if the puzzles aren't good puzzles, if they're not puzzles that draw the player into the story instead of taking him out of the story, I think you've got a problem, and I think that's what happened to the adventure genre. I think it got way expensive, and I think that there was just a whole lot of bad design, and I think the public gave up on it. That's my own take on it. So once again, thank you for coming. Please fill out your forms.